Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. The first thing that I'm going to mention is it's a good idea to have hand and eye protection. After you know you've got that on, continue on to your negative battery terminal. We're going to use a 10mm to loosen this just enough to remove the wire from the battery. Give it a quick inspection. If you see any funny colors, it's corrosion and it would need to be dealt with. This one looks fine, so I'll set it aside. Let's use a jack with a piece of wood, and we're going to carefully get underneath the engine's oil pan. We'll apply a small amount of pressure, essentially holding the engine. Moving over towards the passenger side where the drive belt's located, we're going to be looking for the power steering reservoir. Now we need to dismount this from the bracket. I'm going to use a screwdriver, and if you look right down where my index finger is, there's a small metallic tab. That's a locking tab. I'm going to carefully get in between the plastic of the reservoir and that tab, gently pry while I lift up on the reservoir. Now we can carefully set this aside. Now we can start removing the engine mount. Looking at it, you can see that you have a ground wire that leads to it. Let's use a 10mm socket to remove it. Inspect each bolt as you remove them. Let's get the wire off of here. We're going to give it a quick inspection, make sure you don't see any funny colors. We're going to clean this when we reinstall it, so let's just set it aside for now. Now we can start removing the motor mount. Looking at it, you can see that you have a 17mm nut over here, 17mm headed bolt on the forward end, and then over where it connects onto the body, you have another nut. Let's remove all three. Alright, so it looks like this one took out the whole stud this time. Now the next thing we're going to do is pay attention to this area right down here. This is your serpentine belt tensioner. To relieve the tension and remove the belt, we're going to have to come right down here to this 14mm headed bolt. We'll turn that clockwise, and that's going to relieve tension. Before we do that, let's go ahead and carefully jack up the engine to gain access. Just get my 14mm on there. Now we can slide the belt off of the power steering pump up top. We can get our tool out of here. Now we can move along to the mounting bolts that hold the power steering pump to its mounting bracket. You're going to find one that's located right here. And then the second one is going to be located directly underneath the pulley in this area right here. To remove these, I'm going to use a 12mm socket, and I'm going to start with the harder one to get to. Now we can do this top one. Now we can grab onto the pump and the reservoir, and we're going to carefully lift it up and then swing it out of our way. Now let's move up along the front of the engine compartment. We're going to go ahead and take off this plastic shield. Looking at it, you're going to find several plastic push clips that you're going to have to remove. To remove push clips, it's going to be easiest using a trim tool or even a small pocket screwdriver. Carefully get underneath the center of it and lift it up and away from the outer aspect of it. Once you have the center lifted up, it should be in the unlocked position, in which case you can remove them. Do the same to all. Inspect this piece, set it aside. With that out of the way, we're going to come over to each side of the vehicle and remove the bolt that holds on this bracket. Use a 10mm for that. Do the same on the other side of the vehicle. Once you have both sides done, do the same to this bracket. I'm going to remove this 10mm headed bolt. There is another one that's located down along the side of the radiator, but for us in particular, we're only going to do this top one on both. One on the passenger side, one on the driver's. Now that we have that bolt out of there, let's go ahead and follow it over to the bumper to our trim piece. We'll use our trim tool. We can pop out this push clip from the center. Lift that right out of there. Grab this bracket. Go ahead and carefully pull it out of there. You're just going to have to lift up on the bumper cover a little bit. Do the same on the other side of the car. Now that we took out the top bolt, let's make our way down along the side of that bracket. You're going to find another 10mm headed bolt that holds the bracket to the body. Let's go ahead and remove this bolt and we'll do the same on the other side. Now at this point I've got that nice and loose. I'm going to make my way back up here, grab onto this bracket, and you can see a little stud that comes out from the radiator up and through this rubber bushing. Let's just carefully lift up on this, just enough to slide the radiator out of position. Do the same on the other side of the vehicle. Now let's go ahead and take off the grill area. For this, up along the top, you're going to find a couple push clips. To remove these, I just use my trim tool, come right underneath the center. We'll just carefully lift that up to unlock it. Do the same on the other side of the grill. Now if you just carefully grab onto that grill, give it a tug up along the top. Looking down in between the grill and the radiator, you can see where there's two lower clips as well. On ours in particular, it looks as though they're broken, so I'm just going to go ahead and slide this out of the way. Next, we can start removing our coolant reservoir. For that, you want to start by following the hose up to where it connects onto the radiator. Go ahead and remove it from the radiator and then from its mounting point down in this area. Give that hose a quick inspection, make sure it's soft and pliable and it doesn't appear damaged or worn in any way. Now we can come down here, you're going to see that it's pushed into a mounting point. For that, you just go ahead and slide it right out. Now for this hose, you want to make sure that you have it in the upright position while we continue removing this. If you let it dangle down, gravity will draw any fluid out of the reservoir. Let's remove this 10mm headed bolt. Let's use our 10mm on this. Now let's follow forward a little bit and you're going to find another 10mm headed bolt essentially pretty close to the same area as the other bracket. Let's use our 10mm to remove this bolt. Now let's grab that bracket. We're going to lift it up and off of the AC condenser. There we are. Inspect your bracket. You'll notice on it, it does have an R for the right side or passenger side. Let's do the same on the driver's side, and of course you're going to see an L. Now we have a little bit more wiggle room when it comes to the radiator and AC condenser up along the front. I'm going to carefully grab onto this, putting a little bit of pressure, pulling it towards the front. We can grab onto that reservoir and pull it upright. We'll pull it up into this position so we have more access to be able to remove our alternator. Now at this point, we can go ahead and pull this around a little bit. Now we're going to grab onto the wiring for the fan. Typically, this is going to be held onto the fan in some way. Ours is just broken free. But anyways, I'm going to turn it over, and right where my thumb is, you can find a little squeeze tab. I'm going to squeeze on this, and then I'll separate the two ends. Now that it's disconnected, let's just inspect it for corrosion. This looks fine. Let's move along to dismounting the fan from the radiator. Looking up along the top of the fan, you're going to find two 10mm headed bolts. Remove the pair. Now we can carefully start pulling this up, being very careful not to damage the radiator cooling fins in any way. Set your cooling fan aside. Now let's start removing the coolant overflow from the area. Slide it right off over here, once again being very careful not to damage the radiator in any way. Now at this point I went ahead and I put a mirror down along the front here so you can see the two lower bolts. As you can tell, one of them might be a little bit easier to get to than the other. Now of course there's a third bolt located a little bit higher, it's much easier to see. There is also a little bit of wiring that we're going to have to disconnect, but we'll get to that after we go ahead and remove our bolts. This one's almost out. Let's make our way to that top bolt. Reach down here, hold on to that alternator. Now we can fully remove that last bolt. Keep in mind, this is the last thing holding the alternator in the vehicle, and you still have electrical wiring connected. Do not put a tug on the wiring. Now let's make our way down along the front here. You can see that there's a rubber hose that leads down into this bracket. I'm just going to squeeze right on these two clamp ears here. We'll slide it up the hose. Now we can grab onto that hose. We'll carefully slide it off of there. Give it a quick inspection, make sure it's still soft and pliable. Now we can use our 14mm to remove the tensioner pulley from the tensioner assembly. We'll just give this a quick inspection, make sure it doesn't look like it's rusted around where the bearing should be. This looks fine. We'll set it aside. Now we can continue on by removing the rest of the tensioner assembly. Looking at it, right out in the open, you can find one 12mm headed bolt. The other mounting bolt for this is going to be located on the other side. It's a little harder to see, but just feeling back there, you'll be able to find it. I'll start with the hardest one. With those out of there, let's continue on with our 12mm. I'm going to use a socket, come right in the center here, and we can remove that. Now we can grab onto that tensioner. We're going to wiggle it around a little bit, pull it right out of the way. Just give it a quick inspection. Now that that's out of the way, let's continue on to removing this right here. Let's use our 17mm to remove this. Make sure you don't lose your gasket. We'll set this aside. Now at this point, we can move the alternator around so we can access our wiring. Let's start with the green connector. For that, we're just going to go ahead and press on this little tab where my index finger is and then draw it away. Now at this point, we can go ahead and move the alternator around a little bit. What we want to do is grab onto this rubber boot, which is a protective boot. We'll get that right out of the way. That exposes the nut right there. We'll use a 10mm and we can loosen up this power wire. Grab that wire, pull it off of there, give it a quick inspection to make sure you don't see any funny colors as usual. We'll set that aside. With that disconnected, we can move along to our green connector. For this, right where my thumb is, there's a squeeze tab. Squeeze on that as hard as you can, give this a little wiggle. And you should want to pull it right off of the alternator. Sometimes they can feel stuck. You might need some pliers of some sort. Give it a quick inspection, make sure you don't see any funny colors. We can set that aside. Now let's get the alternator up and out of here. There you are, friends. With the alternator out of there, let's just take a closer look at the wiring. Once again, we're making sure that it doesn't look like there's any funny colors in there. If there is, it's probably corrosion. We also want to pay close attention to this wire right here. This is the power wire that goes directly to that alternator. It needs to be clean and free of any debris on both sides. If it looks like it needs to be cleaned, now's a great time to do it because it's out in the open. Okay friends, now it's time to install our brand new alternator. Before we go ahead and start putting it into place, let's look at the back. We'll go ahead and remove that mounting nut from the rearward stud. Now we can go ahead and slide this down and into the engine compartment. Once we have it in there, we can start reconnecting our wiring before we mount the alternator to its bracket point. Once you have it down in close to position, let's go ahead and take that green connector. We're going to slide it in, listen for a click. There we are. Give it a tug. You want to make sure this is 100% secured. Now we can reconnect our other power wire as well. Let's put the mounting nut on there. Now let's make sure that's tight. It's bottomed out right there. Just make sure it's snug. Okay. Once you're sure it's tight, go ahead and put the rubber boot back over. Now let's go ahead and take a look at our mounting bolts for the alternator. If yours look like ours, it only makes sense to take them to a wire wheel and clean them up. Now we can start putting in our mounting bolts. The longer one goes to the top. Let's get this top area lined up here. Now what we're going to do is we're only going to start in all 3 of the mounting bolts. Once they're all started, you can start snugging them up and then torquing them to manufacturer's specification. With them all started, I can start buttoning them up. Now we can torque each of these mounting bolts to 16 foot-pounds. Let's get this other lower one. Now we can move along to the top. Now let's go ahead and take this apart. We're going to clean this up as well. We can take this, we'll go ahead and start it in by hand. Once we have it bottomed out, we'll just snug it up. Okay, so it's bottomed out. Make sure it's nice and snug so the gasket's making contact with the piece and the bracket. Put our hose on there. You want to make sure it's bottomed out and then slide the clamp into position. Make sure it's secure. Now we can start mounting our tensioner bracket. Make sure you inspect all 3 bolts and clean the threads as needed. Let's slide this into position. Now we'll start with our longer bolt, which goes in the center. Now that I have that one started, let's start in our other 2. Let's get that last bolt in here. Let's torque each of these bolts to 16 foot-pounds. Now we can reinstall our tensioner pulley. For this, you want the bearing hole to fit right over this little piton that's on the assembly itself. Once you have it sitting on there, you can go ahead and put in your mounting bolt, snug it up, and then torque this to 41 foot-pounds. As you can tell, there's minimum room in between this bolt head and the body right here. If you can't fit in a torque wrench, just make sure it's nice and tight. Now let's get the coolant reservoir back into position. Looking at the bottom passenger side of the radiator, you're going to see a rectangular slot. On the bottom of the reservoir, there's a little tab that's going to slide directly into that. Once you have it in, you can go ahead and pull this over into position and start mounting it with the 10mm headed bolt. Now we can go ahead and line this up with the radiator. Start in that mounting bolt, snug it up. Now let's go ahead and get the belt into this position right here. You can tell that I have it down and underneath that tensioner pulley. It's actually going to go underneath the alternator as well in a minute. But let's go ahead and grab onto that power steering pump first and start installing that. Take that reservoir, just going to put it over here for now. We'll get the power steering pump into position. As always, we're going to start in each of the mounting bolts. Once they're both started, we can go ahead and snug them up and torque them to manufacturer's specification. Now let's torque each of these to 16 foot-pounds as well. Now the next thing you want to do is have the belt situated around all of the pulleys, in exception of the power steering pump. After that, we can go ahead and take our 14mm to that tensioner pulley bolt. We'll turn that sideways, and then we should be able to slide the belt onto the power steering pump. Just slide this right on here. Get our tool out of the way. Now you're going to want to take a minute. Inspect that belt. Make sure it's sitting on all of the pulleys correctly. You'll notice a lot of the pulleys have grooves that the grooves of the belt need to sit into. Other pulleys, such as the tensioner pulley, are going to be a smooth pulley. Either way, the belt can't be hanging off of any of them. Double check, triple check, and then you can continue. Now let's get our side bracket in. I went ahead and slid it over the stud here. Now we can start lining up our two other bolt holes. At this point, you may either need to raise or lower the engine to line everything up. Let's put in our two mounting bolts. The one with the large stud was the rearward mounting bolt. Now we can bottom these two out. Let's get that mounting nut on there. Now that we have them all bottomed out, let's torque each of them to 40 foot-pounds. Now we can move along to our ground wire. You want to make sure you sand both points of the contact on the wire and the area on the bracket that it connects to. Once you have everything clean, go ahead and reconnect it. Make sure it's secure and make sure it's in no way touching anything it shouldn't. Now we can resecure our power steering reservoir. Looking at the side of it, you can see these two tabs. They need to fit into this bracket. To do that, we're going to come up nice and high, line it up, slide it down to lock it in. Make sure it's secure so it doesn't rattle loose while you're driving down the road. Okay, so at this point, we can get ready to start reinstalling our cooling fan on this. Looking at the bottom of it, you can find those alignment tabs. Those need to fit in down along the bottom. Just keep that in mind as we start sliding this down and into position. All right. Now that I have it down and in, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that it's in those positions down there. I'm trying to wiggle it, and I can't feel the bottom sliding around. It's definitely stuck into where the tabs need to be. To confirm that, I'm going to go ahead and swing this up and make sure both of my bolt holes line up. They do, so let's start in those bolts and snug them up. Let's reconnect that wiring. Slide it in, listen for a click, give it a tug to make sure it's secure. Now let's move along to resecuring our AC condenser. To do that, we're going to use our brackets that we went ahead and removed. Looking at the top of the AC condenser, you might happen to see a little piton, like this right here, which is supposed to slide into the rubber bushing, or you might happen to see that the rubber bushing is still stuck to it. In either case, you need to make sure you have the bracket and the rubber bushing. We're going to slide this right over it, bringing it down along the side over here. Once it's down under there, you can go ahead and start in that mounting bolt. Now that I have this one started in a few good threads, I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other side. After I have both started, I'll go ahead and snug them up. Make sure that's nice and tight and do the same on the other side. Now let's also resecure the coolant reservoir. Now let's go ahead and grab onto this. I'm going to carefully work it right over this little piton. Now let's line up the mounting bracket. You can see it has the little stud that comes down into that hole, and then we can line up the bolt as well. Make sure that's nice and tight and do the exact same thing on the other side of the vehicle. Now let's reconnect our overflow hose to the radiator. Let's put it right through here. Line it up with the radiator, press it on all the way. Make sure it's completely secure. Now we can install this bracket. We want to pay attention to this hole along here. Also, this area needs to be facing down. Along here, you have your mounting bolt hole. Let's get this into position. To do that, we're going to carefully put it in between the slot of the headlight assembly right in here. Once it's slid in there, we can bring this over. Let's go ahead and start in that mounting bolt. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that these holes are lined up. I'm going to continue on tightening up this bolt until it's nice and tight. We'll do the same on the other side, and then we can go ahead and put our grill on with our push pins. Bottomed out. Make sure it's tight. Do the same on the other side. Now let's put on our grill. You remember down along the bottom, you had those slotted areas that need to fit over the push pin area on the bumper cover itself. Let's go ahead and bring this into position. Once it's slid in, these holes should line up for the push pins. Let's go ahead and take those push pins, start them in, lock them in by pressing down the center. Now we can get this piece on here. We're going to slide it right underneath this handle. Once it's on here, line up all of the push pin holes, put in all the push pins, and then of course lock them down. Okay, let's go ahead and reconnect our negative battery terminal. After that, make sure you tighten it up and then make sure that it doesn't have any movement. Okay friends, we're nearing the end of the video. At this point, what you're going to want to do is carefully start up the vehicle. As soon as you start it up, let it run for approximately 3 to 5 seconds. Turn it right off. After that, climb back out here into the engine compartment. Take a peek at that serpentine belt. You need to make sure it's completely secured on each of the pulleys as it should be. Assuming it is, go ahead and start it up, and you're going to want to take it for a road test. While you're on a road test, make sure you don't have a check engine light, and also make sure you don't have a charging system light. Other than that, thanks for watching.